Hey everyone, welcome to our Figma multiplayer live session. My name is Josh Dunsterville. I'm the community manager at Figma. Hopefully you guys can all hear us all right. I'm joined with Tom, and yeah, so I have been at Figma for just over a year now. I work remotely out of Long Beach, California, which is just south of LA. And yeah, I'm excited to be talking about layout grids with Tom today.
Hey all, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Tom. I also work remotely and I work out of Toronto, Canada, so on the opposite coast.
Where it's much colder. It's like
Much colder, but it's starting to get a little nicer.
It's like sunny and 73 degrees here. It's nice.
I'm jealous.
Awesome. So, first off, before we jump into the demo, we're talking about layout grids, which I think is a little unique to Figma compared to kind of some other tools out there. They're super powerful. I actually don't know too much about them. I rarely use them, so I'm excited to actually learn some things from Tom today. But just yesterday, he published this amazing guide, so definitely check that out on our blog. We're going to basically go through this and kind of show some real world examples. But you can follow along here, and then after the stream, we'll be sure to link the Figma file that we're going to be working out of in the YouTube comments. So, and then this is being recorded, so it will go live on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if you have to jump out or if you miss something, no worries there. So yeah, I'm gonna pass it over to you, Tom, and we can get started.
Cool. So hopefully everyone can see my screen.
I should be able to.
Cool. So I'm going to go over a couple of basics with layout grids. So in Figma, you have three types of grids to choose from. And grids can be used in all sorts of different ways. And one of the things that I really like about Figma is that you can use all of these grids kind of like in tandem with one another. So it's not like one overarching grid setting that gets applied to like all of your frames or artboards. It basically is a property that you can apply to every frame. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these types of grids, but I just wanted to sort of like highlight the basic grid creation or addition process. On anything that you select that's a frame, and of course making a frame is just a matter of pressing F on your keyboard and drawing a new frame. You can also do that by choosing a device size. Like, so if you wanted like an iPhone 8 device, you can make a frame that size that way. But when you pick a frame in the sidebar in the inspector, you've got this option here to add a layout grid. So if you click the plus button, by default, it turns your grids on. You can see I have a whole ton of them in this file. And by default, you get what we generally refer to as a uniform grid. And so when you click on the grid, it opens up this little panel where you can control the size. So if you wanted a 5-pixel grid or a 24-pixel grid, it basically like creating graph paper on your canvas. And where these can be useful is like if you're, you've probably seen a lot of people that are using like an 8-pixel grid or something like that. What's nice about this is that it makes it easier for like when you want to move things and snap things on 8-pixel increments for spacing and things like that. You could use a uniform grid.
With
And then
that,
we also have.
oh sorry, Tom, not to didn't mean to cut you off there, but yeah, with that, make sure if you want to show the settings real quick to make sure you have pixel snapping turned on in the preferences. Yeah,
Yeah, from the
snap.
view menu up here, you can
Yep.
toggle the off and on the snap to pixel grid.
Yep. So it should be on by default, but make sure that's on in case it's not snapping. Check that first. Sorry.
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
yeah, you'll get a lot more fluid movement if you don't have the snapping turned on. And so in addition to the layout grid, from this drop down here, we can also choose other types of grids. So columns and then rows. And so columns and rows are probably the most powerful ones. And when you're creating the grid, there's a few basic properties that you can control. So the first thing that I usually tell people about is this type, which will determine where it's going to be anchored from. So for example, if you have a stretch grid, this grid is always going to stretch however number of columns that you have across the entire artboard. So as it scales down, those columns are going to scale with it. But sometimes when you get to like desktop designs, you might want your grid to sort of like be responsive on mobile and tablet devices, but you may want it to sort of like max out and be centered in your screen. In that case, you could use a center grid. So let's just say we had like 12 columns and we can increase the width of those columns. You may have something like that. So as the artboard scales, those grids are going to stay centered within the screen. And one of the nice things that I like that's really a nice detail is just being able to control what these grids look like, especially when you have multiple being applied to one particular frame. It's just nice when you can differentiate them so that they're easy to discern. And if you want, and sometimes you want them to just be like really faint so you can kind of see that they're there. They don't interfere too much with your design. Other times you may want them to be, quite visible, but you have all that control. And what else is cool is, like I said before, is that you can combine both of these grids or all three of these types of grids on a single frame. So if I wanted an 8-pixel grid and a 12-column grid, and I also wanted to add some rows, and maybe I want to style those completely different, you can do that. And so you can mix and match stretch grids with a centered grid. Another one thing that I often like to do is that if you were designing something like the screen that we have here, you may have a 12-column grid, but there may be parts of your site where the thing that you're designing is going to have maybe, here, let me just duplicate this grid. If you click in one of the non-clickable areas, it'll select the grid. And if you hit like copy and paste, you can actually copy that grid just like any other property. And let's just say I want this to have maybe 3 columns. Then what you could do is you could pick a different color to just sort of like highlight where those 3 columns are going to be. So when you do need to divide your space into 3, you have a grid that you can use for that. And what's nice is that you can toggle these on and off individually, which is really cool. So in this file, which we'll share afterwards, we've created this cheat sheet. So as you start working through these different types of grids, I've basically highlighted what happens to the column heights or widths, what happens to the gutters, and what happens to the margin. So your gutters are going to be these spaces in between each of the columns. And so when you have on all of these types of grids, your gutters are always going to be fixed. On a centered grid or a top-aligned grid, you're always going to define what the width or height of these rows or columns are going to be. And in a stretch grid, those heights and widths are going to be fluid. So hopefully that helps clarify some of the difference between these, and I'll get into a couple of use cases as we work through some different examples in today's stream.
Real quick, Tom, I know you showed how to turn or to hide or show individual layout grids. What is the shortcut to showing all or hiding all?
So you can just hit Control G, and that will show the grids. It'll toggle them across the all of your artboards. These ones you can still see just because I've drawn them for the examples that we put in the article, so that I could actually export them as an image. But basically, if we were to go down here and add a grid, as you press Command G, you'll see this little message at the bottom, toggles it off. You can also do that through the menu as well, to show and hide layout grids.
Awesome.
So that's how you can apply them. Let's go through a couple of the different use cases. So one thing that I like to do is I like to create like a baseline grid. And if you've never used a baseline grid, I'm going to put like together, before we share the file, a little reading list of some stuff that's worth checking out on grids that you can refer to later. But essentially a baseline grid is defined by the bottoms of the typography. So if we look at these two examples here, in more traditional, more rigid mediums like print design, if we look at something like this, often when you have a paragraph spacing and a line height that is sort of like not in sync with one another, then sometimes across columns you get these like really weird looking things where the text doesn't align. So, if I was to bring this text box over, like sometimes the lines of text are offset, and it looks much better when everything shares a consistent baseline. And so as you think of like, let's just say a desktop layout on your screen, you've got all of these things happening, across your screen and in multiple columns. It's a lot more visually pleasant if all of these things are in alignment and sit on the same baselines. But what becomes really interesting is that a lot of times when you have a baseline grid, um, in this particular case, the grid is based on my line height, but you may actually use a smaller increment than your actual line height. So if you look at like Google Material Design, let me toggle grids on this frame. Google Material Design actually uses let me turn off the pixel grid so it's not confusing. They actually use a 4-pixel grid, and everything's in essentially multiples of 8. So as long as your line heights are basically a multiple of 8, your type is always going to fall in one of these baselines. But what becomes really interesting is that once you start using a common increment, you can develop consistent spacing between things, consistent padding on elements, and a lot of the sort of the guesswork out of your process can sort of like, you're not just arbitrarily choosing sizes, you have some sort of like rationalization process that you can use to choose the size of a particular element. So, if we were to, make like a button or something that was like 48 pixels tall, and then we put type inside that button, and maybe it's 16 pixels, and that's on a 24 pixel line height. We could center this thing, snap it to the grid. And so basically right off the bat, you have this like padding on the type that's like a multiple of 4. And we could do the same thing with the horizontal padding. And then as you start factoring in like how other objects are going to space, you might decide to like move that object to be like a multiple of 4 or 8 away from it. And it just gives you some level of standardization. So it's not just like arbitrary spacing. And if you do decide to adopt something like I've seen people use 5-pixel grids a lot on iOS, and then a lot on like Android and web. A lot of people use like an 8-pixel grid. 8-pixel grid, like I would totally vouch for. It's great. One thing that you might want to do if you haven't already done this in Figma is that you can adjust your nudge amount. So you can do that under the preferences menu, and you change your small nudge and your big nudge. So when you hold shift and you nudge things, it's going to nudge in increments of 8. And that applies to like all sorts of things in Figma. So for example, like if we were to put this down here and I hold shift and use an arrow key, right down there, it's 8 pixels. It aligns to one of my grid lines. And it's just an easy way to sort of do the math and keep things consistent. And one other little tip as well, let's just say we do take, this 16 pixel font size. When you hold control over these values and scrub with your mouse, it's going to move them up in 1-pixel increments. So let's go back to 16. If we do the same thing and hold shift, you'll see that it's doing it in increments, larger increments too. And the same thing with some of your other input fields. So hopefully that helps. And then as you start thinking about a baseline grid, again, you probably want to create a visual to do that. So typically rows kind of look like this, where they're just a shaded in area. So it might be worth just like opening up my panel so that you can see what these settings are. So for a baseline grid, you probably want to add the count to be really high, and that'll enable your grid to like continue down as your documents get longer. And then you can change the color. And then in this particular case, because I want these alternating rows, I set the height and the gutter to be the exact same. So if I wanted this to be like a 16 pixel baseline grid, I would just set those two the same, and now I get nice even spacing. In the cases where, and this comes really handy if you're doing stuff for the web, because the way baseline works on the web, it actually gets difficult to align things to the actual baseline of type. So when you think of like line height, your line height is kind of based on whatever pixel value you specify. So line height sort of ends up working like this, where you've got a line of text that sits in between the line height. So you sort of may want to sort of do your visual pacing like this. And we have some updates coming to Figma that is going to make this work a little more truer to implementation. So stay tuned. But on other devices or platforms like iOS, you do have a little bit more control over that. And so some people this is a little bit closer to print design. They want to have like their type sit on on an actual just like 1 pixel, really thin key line. So when you go into your grid settings for this one, I'm going to turn this one off. You'll see that I've set the gutter to 0 and I've set the height. So in this particular case, because we just want this 1 pixel line, all we have to do is define the height of our grid and then set the gutter to 0. And that's what gives us that nice thin line. And so if you are using a smaller increment for your baseline grid, like 4, that's what is used in material design, but you want to have other increments on top of that, maybe something that's based on the line height of your body copy, you could add two baseline grids. And so you'll see that, every few intervals on the baseline, I highlight one, which is sort of like what my typography maps do. So a whole bunch of different ways that you can use these grids as visual aids as you're designing. Moving on. Now this is where layout grids get really fun. Because a layout grid is just this property that gets applied to a frame, you can actually put frames inside frames. So if you think of like those nesting dolls, you could just put like frames inside frames inside frames to your heart's content. So I'll show you, if I just draw a frame here, I can add a layout grid to it. Let's just add some columns. And then I could add another frame in here. Maybe there's a particular part of my design that could benefit, like a table or something that could benefit from having another grid. Maybe it's a row grid. Maybe I style it differently. And so now like I have basically a grid that's within a grid. So as you have like different parts of your site that require their own visual aids, I recommend that you use frames, because being able to add a grid to those things is really powerful. So if we look over on this example, I'll toggle the grids off. We basically have, these two elements here. I've actually added these things just for the purposes of the illustration, but we can get rid of those as well. And when if I enable the grids, you can see that I've got a grid on this frame, I've got a grid on this frame, and I have a grid on the parent. So if we go in here and I toggle these off, you can see the underlying like 12 column grid. And then if we go in here, we can turn these ones on. So this one has a column grid and a row grid, and this one also has columns and rows. And so being able to sort of like have those grids will obviously be really powerful as a visual aid, but it can also help you with resizing. So if we take this example here, I'm going to flip to the next page, which is essentially the exact same grid. And you'll see that now I have items on this grid. And what you're going to notice when I resize this frame is that all of these elements are actually staying and resizing in coordinates with the grid. So where this comes really handy is like as you start thinking of like different layouts you're working on, how the layout is going to be responsive, or even different components that you want to reuse. Often you're going to want to make sure that those things can be resized. So let's go back to the previous grid, and I'll show you how you can use the constraints in combination with the grids. So if we go here, I'll turn on my grid. All I'm going to do is draw a box. And let's just pretend that this is a component. In our design, it doesn't look like anything, but I'm going to turn it into a component. And I'm just going to put the master component out here for now, so we have a nice, easy place to go and maintain the design of it. And what you'll see is that this component now snaps to, this column in my frame. And then what we could do is we could duplicate it. And I'm just using Command D to do that. You can see how like these things are now snapping to the grid. And so now I have these, let me just turn off this grid so you can see it a little bit better. Now I have these columns and rows all set up. So now default, when I move this, new things that you create are going to be anchored to the top left. But the one thing that you'll notice is that no longer is it in relationship to the parent frame the way a normal constraint would be. So for example, let's just take the same version of this grid and let's delete the layout grids off of it. You'll see that these are just anchored to the top left. So the big difference is that once you start adding layout grids, it's going to affect the way your objects respond. So for example, if we take all these objects and we set them to be left and right and top and bottom, they're going to do basically what the other design was doing in this example. So yeah, just do one more example with sort of like a real world example where you may use a nested grid. Let's just say you have an iPhone 8 device, and maybe we make another frame that's going to be our tab bar along the bottom. So we know that our content within the design is probably going to have its own grid, which is fine. And maybe this tab bar is going to have some icons on it. So because this is also a frame, we can add a layout grid within it. So let's do 3 columns. You won't be able to see it until we increase the opacity a little bit. Maybe we'll make this lighter color. And then let's just say we have icons in here. So now what we could do is we want these icons to stay centered in their columns for the tab bar. So when we go up to our constraints here, we can set these to center. And we also want them to be centered vertically within this bar. And we also want this frame to scale with the device frame. So we'll set that to left and right and bottom. And so now what happens is you have these items that are scaling and staying centered with the columns as you scale the viewport. And this object has its own grid. And if we wanted to, even the parent frame could also have its own grid. So let's give it some margins, and let's add some items on here like this. And I'm going to apply some constraints to them. So I want them to be anchored to the left and right of these margins. And then you'll see as we start scaling the design, that fixed column gutter is maintained between the two elements. And it responds exactly how you would most likely want it to in production. And so like if we were to just take a normal frame and just like add these 2 items, if they have left and right constraints, they're not going to scale the way you want. And if we were to take one of these and just add normal scale constraints like this, so scale, you'll see that like all those values are going to change as we get close. Like those gutters are getting smaller. So that's where layout grids will really come in handy.
The cool
Anything
thing
to add?
Yeah, the cool thing too, just I mean, it's not much, but in the here, let me switch to my screen real quick. So within this frame, so you've got the layout grids. Probably the most common use case is if you have an app, you want to test how it would look on landscape. Over in our properties panels, we've got this quick kind of flip mode, I guess, or rotate mode. So when you do that, you'll kind of get an idea for how this looks. So right now, it's not the best because these things are on top of it. But if we actually remove these, I believe it should work. Yeah, there you go. So you can see that, as you rotate it landscape. So this would actually be similar to how it would be implemented within Xcode using auto layout. You would, your tab bar would expand across the full length of the screen. You get, your icons would still be centered within the tab. So just a short little trick there. And then going back to this example, I think it takes a little bit of time setting up all of these grids, but it's definitely worth it. And then let me actually hide these real quick. Just to kind of show off again our smart selection feature. So, you start building these out. They're all within the same, width and height. They're in the grid. You can see these pink dots show up. You can adjust the padding and margins in between that. But the cool thing is you can just then move these around the grid. So if you're setting up some sort of photo grid or masonry layout, this is just a great way to kind of make a lot of different permutations without having to duplicate and do a bunch of extra work to, line them all up. So yeah, I think those were the 2 little tips.
Cool. And one thing to note in these, in this particular file, is if I toggle the grids on, you'll also notice that there's these little grid, almost key lines for the padding on each of these cards. which is what I'm going to show you how to do next. But I just wanted to highlight that components in Figma, especially if we go back to this example here. So here's the component that we made. If we were to take a component and add a layout grid to it, that component basically functions like a frame. So if you want to have like a grid that's within a particular component, you can totally do that. But yeah, going back to what I was saying, if you want to create like a grid that almost looks like this, that just sort of like gives you a really like light, faint indication of like where the padding is to sort of like standardize spacing in your design system or something, then the way that you can do that is, let's just say we create a frame. We can add a layout grid that is a column, and we only give it one row. And you set the margins to whatever padding you want, so maybe 24 pixels, and we set the gutter to 0. And so now we get this faint line. If we want it to be a little bolder, we can just increase the opacity. And because you can copy and paste these things just by selecting them, I'm going to copy this and paste it. So now I have 2 column grids, and then all I'm going to do is switch it to a row. And so now you have this grid that can highlight, the padding. And then of course, like if you want other things to map to it using what we talked about before, if we set the constraints of this thing, top and bottom, give it a background color, now it always maintains that padding, and we can put all of our content into this frame. This frame could have its own layout grid, more grid inception for you. But yeah, that becomes like a really nice way of just like visualizing areas that, you don't want your content to fall outside of. And so that leads me to the next thing, which is like, how do you share grids? So for example, in the article, I gave, this is like obviously a common example where you actually may have a standard grid that you're using for different device viewports. So what we do is we create our grids. So in this case, this has a 12 column grid and a baseline grid that I've created. And if we click on the styles icon, we can add a new style. So let's just call this desktop grid. And we can do the same thing on all of the other ones. So let's create a new style. And we'll do one last one, and we'll create one for the phone. Now you can see I've got 3 different types of grids, and those grids are basically like merging all of those multiple grids that you've created into one easily shareable style. So every time you make a new frame, it's just a matter of going and you can choose that grid. Now, what's cool about this is that this works in very much the same way as components and styles in Figma. So if you want to share these from a library across other files, it's just a matter of going to the assets panel, opening the team library, and then publishing them. And if we publish, we can add a description of what we're publishing. We can now turn on this library and other files and pull these styles right in. So the nice thing is if this is the file that those styles originated from, and you decide that you're going to update your grid, you can update that grid and then push it out to everybody so that everyone is using the same grid, which can just help make sure that people are using consistent spacing and working within sort of like similar confines, which becomes increasingly challenging as you get more people working on different things. So this should definitely help you. And so, going back to this example here, the grids as padding, one of the things that I often do is like, depending on sort of like the depth or the information density within my screen, I may have a few of these grids where I'll say like, okay, this is going to be spacing 24 pixels. Spelt that wrong. And then maybe what I'll do is I'll apply that spacing grid to make a new one. I'll click this little detach icon, which will put them back into normal layout grids. It'll detach the style. And then maybe I want to make like, I don't know, like a 48 pixel one. We can change that. So now we have those 2 spacing sizes, and I can turn this into a new style. Just call it spacing 48 pixels. So now every time I need that, I can just apply it, which includes components that you create. So going back to this version, if we wanted to just apply this to a component, we could totally do that. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you might use layout grids in your own process. I always like them. It just takes a lot of the guesswork out of my process when I'm spacing things or I need to divide the screen equally. So yeah, I hope that.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think one of the best kind of productivity tips is that I've learned is to just focus on using grids or setting constraints, kind of setting up that system before you jump too far into the design, and it will actually save you a bunch of time. Um, Obviously, if you're just kind of messing around and trying to get inspiration, or still kind of figuring out what you're working on, you may get lost in the kind of details of that. But once you set it up, you set them up as styles, you're able to share them with your team. It makes creating these things so much easier. So yeah, layout grids are awesome. I know I'm going to start using them a little bit more. I don't use them as much as I should, but yeah, I know you have a reading list that you want to share on some grids, but also if anyone in the chat has questions, let us know. We have some time right now to answer them. I know there was one from Yugi about plans for animation options in future updates. And while we can't go into too many details, we are working on improving our prototypes. So we definitely want Figma to be more of a kind of all-inclusive design tool. So that does include kind of improving our prototyping offerings. So stay tuned on that. But yeah.
Yeah, and I see another question there about having multiple grid styles at once. Currently, you can't, but that's something that I'd like to see too. Just so you can save each of these grids kind of as an individual style and then apply all three of them, I think would be pretty cool. But yeah, if you have multiple grids, you can combine them into one style. That's probably the best way that I would recommend doing it. And then if you need to add more, then you can detach the style if you don't need to sort of like maintain it across teams, and then add additional grids to that if you want. What I mean by that is, I applied like the spacing thing. I could detach it, and then I could continue to add, additional grids on top of that if I wanted to. So yeah, hopefully that's something that we can support in the future for sure.
One of the things too, I think we missed, or a lot of people actually miss, which is probably something we could improve on, but because frames start with constraints, a question we get often is, how do I resize my frame without without the constraints being active? So all you have to do is just hold down the command or the Windows key, depending on what OS you're on, and it will kind of ignore those constraints. So if I jump to my screen real quick, so this, grid example here, you've got this set up nicely, and then let's say you wanted to add like another section below. If I were to drag this right now, it would affect the entire grid. If I just hold down command and then drag it down, it's going to increase, and you can put in another section here. So remember that command key trick. It will save you a ton of time and headaches.
I see there's also some questions about tables. We could try to cover some table stuff. I don't know if you're sharing my screen.
Yeah, it's back on your screen.
Cool. Yeah, so this is not, tables are a pretty complicated one. I have some tables that I've built where I used to work that were pretty complex, so they'll be hard to build from scratch for the purposes of today. But basically, one of the things that I'll often do when building a table, especially something that's going to become part of my design system, is that I'll do something like this where I'll take almost like, I'll turn this column header into a component, and I'll almost like itemize everything that I'm doing. So another part of that might be, actually, let me put that back. Another part of my process is usually like creating a whole bunch of like little atoms that you can use. So for example, let's just say this is a row. Maybe there's like something like a checkbox or something where you can select the row, and like that'll become a component. And then, so let's just take then what I'll do is inside this component with all of these pieces of text, I will set the constraints to be left and right for the items within it, and then I'll anchor them all to the top. And then I'll also clip the content. So if you hit clip content when you resize this, it's going to hide everything that's like outside of that thing. And then as you start like putting instances of these things on a column and aligning them to like a layout grid, you can set these anchors to left and right, something like that. And then maybe you also have something like this. And this may, I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but this may also become like another sort of like atom that you create. And in that case, I'll also set those constraints to be left, right, and top, and set clip content on this component. And so now you can expand these down as well. So when we start like putting that into the design, as we resize things down, we can actually show more information. So I'll set this to left and right, and then top and bottom. And then so as you scale, everything's going to scale together and map to the layout grid, but also like in instances where you need more rows. Oops, I forgot to anchor these to the bottom. Top and bottom. There we go. So yeah, then instances where you're like, okay, we want to show 4 rows, then you can expand this down and show other rows, and then have all of the stuff still mapped to a grid. So often what I'll do is I'll like take something like this and turn it into a component, and then I'll share that out. And then when I need to use it, I'll detach it, and everything else still stays a component inside. And then I'll configure the table based on however many columns and rows that I need. But that's something I'd love to do like a deeper dive article on, because there's like so many little nuances to that. But hopefully that is sort of like a good starting point. Anything else to add, Josh?
No, that's great. Do you want to share your kind of reading list? I know I'd like.
I'm gonna add some links to it after
Okay.
the thing, and when we post it, everyone can go and check out the reading link. But there's a few links that I want to point to, like about the 8-pixel grid, and then some books that are worth checking out.
Awesome. Give me 1 second here. I just put in our Twitter handles in the chat. So we're both, Tom and I are pretty active on Twitter. Feel free to reach out to us. My DMs are open. I'm not sure about yours, Tom, but
Mine are open too.
cool. Yeah. So if you do have any additional questions, like we'd be more than happy to answer them there. We also plan on doing more of these live streams on kind of a weekly basis. We want to start branching out and doing some more kind of AMAs or interviews, doing some different demos around designing some, more real life examples within Figma. So if you have any ideas, if you'd like to see, a designer that you follow on these streams, definitely let us know on Twitter. But yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and happy Figma Friday.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Take care and have a great weekend.